My dad used to call himself a somnambulist, a fancy word for a sleepwalker, but the way he said it made it sound magical, like a secret skill only he possessed. He'd joke, "Sometimes the worlds I wander through at night, I like 'em better than this one." He'd smile when he said it, but there was always a faraway look in his eyes, like he was already halfway back to those dreamlike realms. Mom, on the other hand, was never amused by Dad's sleepwalking. It terrified her. She'd warn him endlessly, her voice sharp with worry. "If you fall down that wooden staircase, I swear to God," she'd say, shaking her head, her hands wringing the dish towel like it was Dad's stubborn neck. And she wasn't just worried about Dad. She worried about me too. Apparently, sleepwalking could run in families. So, every night, she handed me a little white pill with a glass of water. "Swallow," she'd command, watching closely to make sure I didn't spit it out or hide it. The medicine worked. My nights were heavy with dreamless sleep, like sinking into a warm, silent ocean. But one morning, everything changed. I woke up to find Mom sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly into a bowl of cereal. The milk had turned her frosted flakes into mush, but she didn't seem to notice. Her shoulders shook, silent tears streaking down her face. "Mom," I asked, my voice small. "What's wrong? Where's Dad?" Her answer hit like a thunderclap. One word: gone. I waited for her to explain, but she didn't. She just sat there, cradling her head in her hands, lost in her grief. But I knew. Deep down, I knew what had happened. Dad hadn't just disappeared. He walked too far into one of those worlds he loved so much. The thought made my chest tighten, but I refused to cry. If he wasn't coming back, I'd have to go get him. That night, when Mom handed me the pill, I smiled and obediently took it. I even drank the whole glass of water. But as soon as she left the room, I spit it out, letting the bitter taste linger on my tongue like defiance. I wasn't going to sleep like I usually did. I was going to sleepwalk. I grabbed a ball of red yarn from Mom's sewing kit. It was frayed and dusty, but it would do. Tying one end securely to my bedpost, I looped the other around my thumb. I'd read about this trick once in a story, Theseus and the Labyrinth. If a ball of yarn was good enough to help him escape a deadly maze, it was good enough for me. Lying back down, I felt the pulse of my heart in my hand, the yarn pressing against my skin. My eyes grew heavy, and soon I wasn't just asleep. I was standing. It was strange, seeing with my eyes closed. Everything around me was hazy but vivid, like looking through frosted glass. My body moved on its own, following some instinct I couldn't understand but completely trusted. I held the yarn tightly, feeling its pull as I walked forward. The walls of my room rippled, then shifted, like a mirage dissolving into something else entirely. Suddenly, I was in a long, dim hallway. The air felt heavier here, charged with something ancient. At the end of the hall, I spotted it, two batwing doors, the kind you'd find in an old Western saloon. They creaked softly as they swung open, beckoning me forward. My fingers trembled as I pushed them wide. The room on the other side was alive with noise and movement. Shadowy figures, almost human but not quite, sat at round tables, their faces obscured by flickering light. The air smelled of whiskey and old wood, and the sound of a piano played softly in the background. And then there he was. Dad. He sat alone at a corner table, his head bowed, staring into a half-empty glass. He looked different, tired, older, but it was him. My heart surged as I called out, "Dad." He turned slowly, his eyes widening in shock when he saw me. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "I'm here to rescue you," I declared, standing tall. His expression darkened. "No, you shouldn't be here. It's too dangerous. You have to leave. Now." I crossed my arms, refusing to back down. "Not until you tell me what's going on." He sighed, his shoulders slumping. "All right," he said finally, "but you need to listen carefully." And so he began to explain. Dad leaned back in his chair, eyes distant as he spoke. The sound of the piano in the background seemed to fade away, and the weight of his words took over. "The gates to every afterlife are closed," he began, his voice low and grave. "That's why this place exists, the in-between. It's where the souls of the dead get stuck, left with no place to go. And now, it's filling up. The more souls pile in, the closer it gets to spilling over into the world of the living." My mind reeled as I tried to process what he was saying. This wasn't just some dreamlike place, it was real. "But why are you here?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to stay calm. "Why can't you come back?" He met my gaze, the weariness in his eyes cutting through the fog of confusion. "I can't leave until I stop it. If I don't, everything we've known, everything we hold dear, it could all be lost. I have to stop the flow from this place before it destroys the living world too." I shook my head, feeling a tightness in my chest. "But you're stuck here. How can you stop it?" He paused, considering my words carefully. "I'm not sure I can, but I have to try. If I can hold the line, maybe it'll give the living world enough time to prepare for what's coming. I just need to keep it contained. If I fail..." He trailed off, the unspoken consequence hanging in the air. I didn't like the sound of that, but the fear inside me shifted into something else. A determination. "I'm not leaving without you," I said, my voice firm. "There has to be a way." Dad looked at me for a long moment, studying my face. I could see the hesitation in his eyes, but also a glimmer of something. Hope, maybe. He knew I wasn't going to back down. Not this time. With a slow, reluctant nod, he rose from the table. "All right, let's try to find a way out. But you have to listen to me. If anything goes wrong, you must leave immediately. Promise me that." I nodded eagerly. "I promise." We started walking, following the invisible thread of the yarn as it led us deeper into the saloon. The people who had been seated at the tables before had disappeared, their seats now empty. The air had become colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer, more twisted. It felt like we were walking through a dream, one that was growing darker the further we went. Soon, the path we were on narrowed, twisting into a narrow corridor lit by faint, flickering lanterns. As we walked, I felt an odd sensation creeping up my spine, like someone, or something, was watching us. "We're getting close," Dad murmured, his voice steady. "I can feel it." I nodded, but a lump formed in my throat. Something didn't feel right. The yarn tugged at my thumb, pulling me forward. It was as though it had a life of its own, guiding me, even as I struggled to stay focused on my dad's words. "We're almost there," he said, looking over his shoulder. "But we need to hurry." The moment the words left his mouth, the yarn went limp. I could feel it in my hand, the thread slackening, growing weaker. Panic gripped my chest as the cold, heavy air around us thickened. "They know you're here," Dad said, his voice shaking now. "We've been detected. There's only one way out." I turned to him, panic rising in my throat. "What do you mean? What's happening?" Dad hesitated, his hand gripping my shoulder. "I can't leave. I've been here too long. But you can still go. You have to go back. You're the only one who can." I shook my head, eyes wide. "No, I'm not leaving without you." He looked at me with a sorrowful smile. "You have no choice. If you stay, you'll get stuck here too. You don't belong here. I do." He took my hand and pressed something cold into my palm. I looked down, and to my shock, I saw my own top-knot sword, the one he'd made me leave behind so many years ago. The one I never thought I'd see again. "You're strong. You're ready for this," he said, his voice cracking. "But I'm not. This is where I end." Tears welled up in my eyes, But I wiped them away quickly, determined not to show weakness. "I'm not leaving you." But before I could protest any further, Dad kissed me on the forehead, and in one swift motion, he pushed me backward. The world spun around me. I felt weightless, falling through an endless void. The sensation was unlike anything I had ever experienced. A twisting, disorienting plunge into nothingness. The sound of my own heartbeat pounded in my ears, the only thing grounding me. And then, suddenly, pain. A sharp, searing pain spread through my body, starting from my chest and radiating outward. I gasped, barely able to catch my breath as the world blurred into shadows. The pressure in my chest intensified, and for a moment, I thought I might suffocate. And then, nothing. Silence. I woke with a start, gasping for air. My surroundings were unfamiliar, the cold air stinging my skin. I tried to move, but couldn't. My body was paralyzed, and for a moment, I thought I might be dreaming again. But then I remembered. I was at the bottom of the staircase. The very same one Dad had always warned me about. The one he had always feared I would fall down. I couldn't move. My body was numb, and all I could hear was the frantic, panicked voice of my mother calling my name from the top of the stairs. Her voice echoed in the distance, a sound so full of terror that it made my heart shatter. And then the ambulance arrived. Doctors crowded around me, their voices muffled as they examined me. But I couldn't focus on their words. All I could think about was Dad. Had I saved him? Was he still out there? The doctor's voice cut through my foggy thoughts. "You'll never walk again." I didn't respond. But inside, I knew there was more than one way to walk, and I would find it. Session 3. The Price of Determination. The days after the accident passed in a haze. Hospital lights were always too bright, conversations too muffled to focus on. My body felt like a weight I couldn't escape, an anchor tying me to a bed that felt more like a cage. Doctors came and went, their faces blending together, all delivering the same somber prognosis. "You'll never walk again." But their words didn't touch me. Not really. I wasn't thinking about my legs, or the staircase, or even my mom, who sat beside me every day with tear-streaked cheeks and a fragile smile. My thoughts were with Dad, the in-between. The words he'd whispered, the urgency in his voice, they haunted me. He was still out there. I could feel it. And if I had to drag myself through fire and darkness to get to him, I would. But first, I needed to leave the hospital. Getting home wasn't the relief I thought it would be. The house felt empty, like a hollow shell of what it used to be. Mom tried her best to make it feel normal, cooking my favorite meals and chatting about mundane things, but her efforts felt strained. I could see the guilt in her eyes. She blamed herself for my fall, for my broken body. And maybe, somewhere deep down, I blamed her too. After all, she'd been the one so desperate to keep me from sleepwalking. The pills, the rules. But none of that mattered now. The past couldn't be changed. What mattered was the mission. A week after I came home, I made my first attempt. It was late, the house cloaked in silence, except for the rhythmic hum of rain against the windows. Mom was asleep upstairs, her soft snores drifting down the hallway. I reached for the ball of red yarn I'd hidden under my mattress. My hands shook as I tied it around my thumb and secured the other end to the bedpost. This time, I didn't need the medicine. I could feel a pull of sleep tugging at me, the promise of something deeper waiting beyond the veil of dreams. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and waited. It didn't take long. The familiar sensation returned, the weightlessness, the tingling in my limbs, as if my body were being gently lifted by invisible hands. And then I was standing. This time, I didn't need to feel surprised by the sight of myself moving, my legs steady beneath me. I knew what to expect. My eyes were shut, but I could see. The world around me shifted and blurred, my bedroom dissolving into shadowy shapes and muted colors. The yarn tugged, and I followed. The transition was seamless, like slipping into a dream you didn't realize you were having. One moment, I was in the faintly glowing space between sleep and wakefulness, and the next, I was back in the in-between. It was darker this time, colder. The air felt heavy, pressing against my chest. The saloon was gone, replaced by a barren expanse of mist and shadows. The ground beneath my feet was slick and uneven, like wet stone. "Dad?" I called out, my voice echoing into the void. No answer. I tightened my grip on the yarn, the only lifeline tethering me to safety. But the string was different now, thinner, weaker. Each step forward made it feel more fragile, like it might snap at any moment. "Dad," I shouted again, louder this time. A sound echoed in the distance, footsteps, faint but deliberate. I turned, my heart pounding, straining to see through the swirling mist. And then I saw him. He emerged slowly, his figure hazy and distorted at first. But it was him. Dad. Relief flooded me, but it was short-lived. Something was wrong. He looked different. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. He stood stiffly, like a puppet on strings, his movements jerky and unnatural. "Dad?" I asked cautiously, taking a step closer. But he didn't respond. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, a strange, unnerving smile creeping across his lips. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice distant and cold. I froze, confusion and fear battling for control in my mind. "What's happening? What's wrong with you?" He took a step forward, and I instinctively backed away. "You don't understand," he said, his voice echoing strangely. "You don't belong here. You need to leave." His words were familiar, but the tone was all wrong. This wasn't my dad. Not really. "You're not him," I said, my voice trembling. The figure tilted its head again, the smile widening unnaturally. "Clever girl," it said mockingly, and then it lunged. The thing moved fast, faster than I thought possible. I barely had time to react, stumbling backward as its outstretched hands reached for me. The yarn in my hand pulled taut, the thread cutting into my skin as I scrambled to stay upright. "Leave," the figure shrieked, its voice warping into something monstrous. I ran, my legs moving without thought or hesitation. The ground beneath me seemed to shift and twist, trying to trip me, but I didn't stop. The yarn was my guide, my anchor, and I clung to it desperately, following its pull. Behind me, the creature's footsteps echoed, growing louder with every second. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. I turned, gasping for breath, and saw nothing but darkness. The thing was gone, but its presence lingered, an oppressive weight pressing down on me. The yarn tugged again, pulling me forward, and I didn't hesitate. When I woke, I was back in my bed, drenched in sweat. My heart pounded in my chest, and my hands trembled as I untied the yarn from my thumb. I'd failed. Dad was still out there, and now I knew I wasn't the only one looking for him. The next day, I couldn't shake the encounter. The figure that had worn Dad's face haunted me, its hollow eyes and unnatural movements burned into my memory. What was it? Why had it taken his form? Mom hovered nearby, her worry palpable. She'd noticed my restlessness, the bags under my eyes, and the way I avoided her questions. But she didn't press me, which was a small mercy. I couldn't explain any of this to her, even if I wanted to. What could I say? That I was using sleepwalking to wander through a realm of shadows, trying to find the dad she thought was just gone. She'd never believe me, and even if she did, it would only deepen her grief. I kept the truth locked inside, letting her believe I was just struggling to adjust to my new reality. But I had no intention of adjusting. Not when Dad was still out there. That night, I prepared myself again. I tightened the knot on the yarn, testing its strength. The thread was my only link to safety, and after last night, I wasn't taking any chances. I also grabbed a flashlight from my nightstand and tucked it under my pillow. It was small, barely more than a keychain, but it was something. As the house grew quiet and the familiar hum of rain began to fill the air, I let my body relax, sinking into the soft pull of sleep. It didn't take long. The in-between was different this time. The barren, misty expanse had given way to something more structured. I found myself standing in what looked like a decrepit, forgotten town. Broken buildings lined a narrow street, their windows shattered and roofs caved in. The ground was uneven, a mix of cobblestones and dirt, and the air smelled faintly of mildew and decay. I turned slowly, taking it all in. The town was eerily silent, the only sound the faint rustling of wind through the hollow shells of the buildings. The yarn tugged at my thumb, pulling me forward. I followed cautiously, my flashlight clenched tightly in my hand. Its weak beam barely pierced the darkness, but it was better than nothing. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows seemed to shift and move, twisting into shapes that vanished the moment I looked directly at them. My skin prickled with unease, but I kept moving. The yarn led me to the center of the town, where a large, crumbling building loomed. It looked like it might have once been a courthouse or a church, its tall, arched windows now little more than empty frames. I hesitated at the entrance, the sense of being watched growing stronger. The yarn pulled insistently, urging me forward. Taking a deep breath, I stepped inside. The interior of the building was worse than I'd expected. The walls were lined with tattered, moldy tapestries, and the floor was littered with debris, broken furniture, shattered glass, and scraps of paper that disintegrated at the slightest touch. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and the faint sound of whispers echoed from somewhere deep within. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and followed the yarn as it wound its way through the maze of debris. The whispers grew louder as I walked, their tone urgent and frantic. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound made my skin crawl. And then, I saw him. Dad. He was standing at the far end of the room, his back to me. His posture was rigid, and he seemed to be staring at something I couldn't see. Dad. I called out, my voice breaking the oppressive silence. He didn't move. I hurried toward him, my heart pounding in my chest. The yarn tugged harder, as if warning me to stop, but I ignored it. Dad, it's me, I said, reaching out to touch his shoulder. The moment my hand made contact, he turned. It was him, really him this time. His eyes weren't hollow, and his face wasn't twisted into a grotesque smile. He looked tired, yes, but alive. You shouldn't be here, he said softly, his voice tinged with both relief and fear. I had to come back, I said, tears welling in my eyes. I couldn't leave you here. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. You don't understand. This place, it's dangerous. It's not just a world of shadows. It's alive, and it knows you're here. I don't care, I said, my voice firm. I'm not leaving without you. He stared at me for a long moment, and then his expression softened. You're just like me, he said quietly, stubborn to a fault. He reached out and took my hand, his grip warm and steady. All right, let's get out of here, together. We started back the way I had come, following the yarn. The whispers had grown louder now, more insistent, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to writhe and pulse with unnatural energy. As we stepped outside, the town seemed to shift and change. The buildings twisted, their shapes warping into something almost organic. The cobblestones beneath our feet pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat. Keep moving, Dad said, his voice low. I nodded, gripping the yarn tightly as we hurried down the street. But then, the shadows began to take form. Figures emerged from the darkness, their shapes flickering and indistinct. They moved with an unnatural grace, their limbs bending in ways that defied logic. They're coming, Dad said, his voice filled with urgency. We have to move faster. The figures closed in, their hollow eyes fixed on us. Run. And we did. The air grew colder as we ran, each breath a sharp reminder of the urgency pounding in my chest. The shadows behind us moved like a tide, their forms shifting and twisting into grotesque shapes as they surged forward. Their whispers were no longer faint. They were loud, a cacophony of eerie voices overlapping in a haunting chorus. "This way," Dad shouted, pulling me sharply to the left. I tightened my grip on the yarn, letting it guide me even as my legs burned with the effort of keeping pace. The ground beneath us was no longer solid. It rippled and warped with every step, as though the world itself was trying to pull us back. "What are they?" I asked, my voice trembling. "They're echoes," Dad replied without looking back. "Fragments of souls trapped here for too long. They'd forgotten who they were, what they wanted. All they know now is hunger, and you've caught their attention." A chill ran down my spine. The figures were faster now, their movements erratic and unnatural. Some crawled on all fours, their limbs bent at impossible angles, while others floated just above the ground, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. I glanced back and immediately wished I hadn't. One of them was closer than I thought, its face a mask of shifting features, as if it couldn't decide what form to take. It reached out with long, claw-like fingers, and I stumbled in panic. "Don't look back," Dad barked, grabbing my arm and steadying me. We turned another corner, and suddenly, the yarn went slack in my hand. I stopped, panic surging through me as I looked down at the thread. The vibrant red that had been my lifeline now faded to gray, the end of the string frayed and singed. "It's gone," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Dad's face tightened. "They've severed it. They know how to trap you here now." My heart sank. Without the yarn, there was no way back. The shadows closed in, their whispers growing louder and more distorted. One of the figures stepped forward, its shape solidifying into something almost human. Its face was familiar, too familiar. It was me. The creature wore my face, but its expression was twisted, its eyes wide with malice, and its lips curled into a cruel smile. "What's the matter?" It taunted, its voice a warped echo of my own. "Afraid of yourself?" I froze, my legs refusing to move. Dad stepped between us, his stance protective. "She's not afraid of you," he said firmly, "and neither am I." The creature laughed, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. "You can't protect her forever. She doesn't belong here, and neither do you. This place will devour you both." "Not today," Dad snapped. He grabbed my hand and pulled me forward, pushing past the creature as the other shadows surged toward us. We found shelter in a small, crumbling building near the edge of the town. The walls were barely standing, and the roof had long since collapsed, but it was enough to buy us a few moments of rest. I collapsed onto the floor, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. Dad crouched beside me, his eyes scanning the entrance for any sign of movement. "We can't stay here long," he said, his voice low. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice trembling. "The yarn's gone. How do we get out?" Dad hesitated, his expression grim. "There's another way, but it's dangerous." I swallowed hard. "What is it?" He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of determination and fear. "There's a rift, a tear in the fabric of this place. It leads back to the living world, but it's unstable. It's not meant to be used. What happens if we use it?" His jaw tightened. "It could kill us. Or worse, it could trap us between worlds, leaving us in eternal limbo." I felt a lump form in my throat. "And if we stay here?" His silence was answer enough. The shadows outside were growing louder, their whispers turning into guttural growls. They knew where we were. "We don't have a choice," I said, forcing myself to my feet. "We have to try." Dad looked at me, his expression softening. You've always been braver than I deserved." He stood and took my hand. "All right, let's go." The rift was exactly as Dad described, a jagged tear in the air, pulsing with an unnatural light. It hovered just above the ground, its edges flickering like static on an old TV screen. The air around it crackled with energy, and the faint sound of distant voices echoed from within. "This is it," Dad said, his grip on my hand tightening. The shadows were close now, their forms spilling into the clearing around us. They didn't speak this time. They didn't need to. Their intent was clear. Dad turned to me, his expression resolute. "You go first." "What about you?" "I'll hold them off. Once you're through, I'll follow." "No," I shouted, tears streaming down my face. "I'm not leaving without you." He cupped my face in his hands, his touch warm and steady. "You have to trust me. I'll be right behind you. I promise." I hesitated, my heart breaking as I looked into his eyes. "You better not break that promise," I said, my voice shaking. He smiled, a hint of his old warmth returning. "I won't." The shadows surged forward, their growls deafening. "Go," Dad shouted, pushing me toward the rift. I hesitated for only a moment before stepping into the tear. The world around me dissolved into light and sound, my body pulled in every direction at once. And then, nothing. When I woke, I was back in my bed. The house was silent, the rain outside a soft patter against the window. I sat up slowly, my heart pounding as I looked around. "Dad?" I whispered, but there was no answer. I reached for the ball of yarn under my pillow. It was still there, but something was different. The end of the thread was tied in a perfect knot. The knot in the yarn haunted me. I sat in my bed, holding the thread between trembling fingers, the tight loop mocking my sense of hope. Dad had promised to follow, but the silence of the house pressed down like a weight. The knot wasn't a coincidence. It was a message. Somehow, Dad had sent it. He was alive, still trapped in the in-between, but he'd managed to reach out. The realization hit me like a jolt of electricity, filling me with equal parts determination and dread. I wasn't done. Not yet. The next few days were a blur. I could barely focus on anything as I prepared for what I knew would be my final journey. The rift had been a lifeline, but it was dangerous, unstable. If I was going back, I needed another plan. The answer came in an old book I found tucked away in the attic, a dusty tome filled with myths and stories about ancient paths between worlds. One passage caught my eye. "When the tether fails, follow the echo of your heart. The bond of love cannot be severed, even by death." It wasn't much, but it was all I had.